So OHMA, the Oral History Master of Arts, it was founded in 2008 by Mary Marshall Clark, who's the director of the Columbia Center for Oral History, and Peter Behrman, who's the director of Insight. And so we're a truly interdisciplinary one-year master's program. Our students in their required courses get training in historical, literary, and social science analysis of oral history narratives, as well as practical skills like audio and video recording, multimedia project design, audio editing. And so we really pride ourselves on sort of incorporating a blend of theory and practice and analysis and research throughout the curriculum. And our students go on to do master's thesis work that is in a huge range of formats. So we have students who produce theater pieces, as Kristen did. We have students who produce audio documentaries. We have students who produce theoretical treatises on memory, historical research papers. And this, of course, leads them into a variety of different paths in life. So we're very proud to have a number of our students in PhD programs in a range of fields from anthropology to history of consciousness and history right now. Many of our students go on to do human rights, advocacy, and legal work, and this ongoing partnership with Voice of Witness has been really exciting for us in sort of cultivating the ways that oral history narratives can be used to do that kind of work. We have strong relationships with people in the fields of museum studies, museum anthropology, archives, and public history. And a lot of our students go on to do activist and advocate work, both sort of in big questions like human rights that are international and in small-scale local movements. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to say a little bit about how she came to the program and what her experience was, and then we'll hear from Gabriele and Juliet.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I thought I'd start out by telling you a little story about a time that I doubted what I was doing in the program and the way that being here in New York City kind of reaffirmed what I was doing. I was on a subway train and I was thinking about the thesis project I had chosen to do. I was going to interview Catholic nuns, and I was going to originally write a paper about it, but then later on decided I wanted to do a play. But as I started in the project, I wasn't really sure if nuns were a topic that were kind of worthy of like an academic thesis project, if anybody would be interested in it. And I step out of the train at Penn Station, and there's this woman there about the same height as me, and she says, "Oh, excuse me, can you please help me? I'm lost." I said, sure, and she needed to get to the train station. So I said, well, I'll just walk with you. So I started walking with her, and as we're talking, she starts telling me her life story, just by accident. And right when I was taking her to the train, then she stops and tells me that she had been a nun at one point and decided to leave and took on a different path and became a nurse, and then she was caring for nuns who were elderly at the time. And I thought, this is the city telling me that I need to continue with my project. So I guess I should tell you kind of how I ended up here. I was a creative writing student at a small public university, and I thought I would end up in a magazine or working in writing. When I was there, I was able to do a couple of projects that ended up involving oral history. One of the projects, we as a class interviewed peacemakers, and then took the stories and created a script and performed it. And another project, we were able to make our own life stories or our own stories into like digital formats, digital storytelling. And I made a film that kind of explored the history of my family. There's a progressive political leader, Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, who was part of my family. So I looked into his legacy and then how it maybe somehow influenced me and the future generation. So I did that work, and I thought, wow, this is great. I was able to go to conferences and present, but I thought, what kind of future can I get out of this? I'm just going to have to continue. So I ended up working and doing some magazine work, and then I ended up in special education, helping students find jobs. I was applying to master's program, and I thought I would go back into creative writing. And as I was doing the applications, it just didn't really feel quite right. And I thought about those projects I had done before that were oral history. And so I heard about the program, I applied thinking I wouldn't get in, but I did get in. So then that took me here. And I was so grateful that I've been able to be here. Being able to do the thesis project was incredible. I met an incredible group of nuns. And actually the project that I did kind of dovetailed with another group project that I did when I was here, where I worked with other students on an audio piece on hydraulic fracturing. And as we were researching people to interview, I found a sister who is a big advocate against hydraulic fracturing in Pennsylvania. And so I was able to interview her for the audio piece and for my thesis project. I was also able to go and interview people for other projects involving hunger and advocacy around that with America Vistas. I went to food banks and interviewed people there. Now I'm interviewing students, second grade students at a charter school. And I'm also working on a side project with a friend to do another theater piece involving residents of Manhattanville. And I also work at the Center for Oral History. So I know that's a lot to take in, but I feel like being here in New York, there's an incredible network of oral historians, and it's a perfect place to be if this is something that you're interested in. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. So if anyone has any questions about the program, please feel free to talk to me or Kristen, or could students and alumni and faculty who are in the room raise your hands? So if you're interested, feel free to talk to one of them. And our application deadline is April 15th. We have some brochures in the back table, and feel free to check out our website and our ongoing events. So as I said, we're so excited to be collaborating with Voice of Witness. These books are one of the sort of primary ways that oral histories are really getting out and affecting public discourse in the U.S. right now. And the range of subjects that they work on is really exciting, and especially when they think about human rights in an American context, I think that's really important work. So let me just introduce Gabriele Stabile, is an Italian photographer based in New York City. His photography has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And Juliet Linderman is a reporter for the Times-Picayune. She's formerly editor of a small community newspaper and has written for many publications, including the New York Times and the Village Voice. She'll be talking a little bit tonight, I hope, about the relationships between oral history and journalism, and her exciting new life with a full-time job as a newspaper reporter, which for the journalists in the room exists, and isn't that exciting? So welcome, and thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. We just had an awesome session with Amy and her class. What an amazing program. This oral history master's program is amazing. So I'm Juliet, and this is Gabriele, and we're going to talk about The Refugee Hotel, which is our new book that came out pretty recently. And it is a book of oral histories of refugees and their experience in the United States within the first 2 years. And Gabri started taking photographs of these refugees on their first night in the United States, in the airports, in the hotels next to the airports where they flew into. And then, a few years later, he and I traveled around to the towns and cities where they resettled and did oral histories with them, and Gabri took some photos. So all of it is in here. So I was gonna read a little bit from the introduction first, just to kind of give a little bit of context. And then I think we were going to look at some images, and then I was going to read oral history, and then we can chat. If that sounds good to you guys. Yeah, so this is just a part of the introduction. Bashir Abshir never thought he'd live in America. Born and raised in Mogadishu, Somalia, he tells us about his childhood playing soccer on the shores of the Indian Ocean, his work as a teacher, and the life he built with his wife and children. It was a good life, he says, a beautiful life. But in 1991, when Bashir was 23 years old, he was forced out of Somalia by an eruption of tribal violence that soon engulfed the country in civil war. After a perilous 4-month journey, Bashir and his family made it across the border to Kenya's Utanga refugee camp, where he relinquished his Somali citizenship in exchange for sanctuary and refugee status. He was eventually selected for third country resettlement and sent to Rochester, Minnesota. 17 years later, Bashir is an American citizen. Somalia is my mother country, he says, but I took an oath, I adopted this life, and I will raise my children here. Bashir is among the estimated 64,000 refugees who each year flee war, insurgent violence, or religious persecution in their country's origin and are granted entry into the United States and Canada. These men and women endure a resettlement process that is often long, arduous, and largely invisible. After being temporarily placed in a refugee camp in a neighboring country, the wait to emigrate can sometimes take decades. Across oceans, continents, and contested borders, the journey to the U.S. is vastly different for each refugee, though it lands many of them in the same place, a hotel next to the airport. Just as the banks of Ellis Island once served as the gateway to America for millions of European immigrants, these hotels serve as a gateway to new, unfamiliar life for refugees of the 21st century. The hotels, the same structures that apologetically receive weary travelers whose flights have been canceled or indefinitely delayed, host these refugees for a single night upon arrival. The next day, they are bused back to the airport, ushered onto an airplane, and scattered across the country to various destinations for resettlement. But first, it is here, in identical hotel rooms, where those displaced from their country's origin will begin their new lives. Each will enter through the same revolving door, look out the same windows, and see the same anonymous interstate, parking lot, McDonald's, or Burger King. These refugee hotels, transitional spaces between the past and future lives of their temporary inhabitants, served as a point of entry for us into the stories of the men and women in these pages, stories of what they left behind, what they've carried with them, and what it means to belong, stories containing different visions and versions of America. One night in 2008, a large family of Somali refugees gathered together in a hotel foyer down the road from Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey. They were dressed in a patchwork of traditional Somali clothes and hand-me-down winter coats distributed by a relief organization, trying to adjust to the unfamiliar cold of the East Coast winter. Instead of retiring to the room assigned to them, the many members of this family stayed in a hallway decorated with wall-to-wall carpeting, stiff cushioned chairs, and a couple of vending machines. They sat there all night, awake and in sight, for fear of being forgotten and left behind. The following morning, a bus arrived at the hotel to pick them up and take them back to the airport, where they boarded a plane for Minnesota. After their departure, the foyer was cleaned and ordered, all noticeable traces of them gone. Through the oral histories and images in Refugee Hotel, we hope to challenge general entrenched assumptions that refugee populations are part of one homogeneous mass, and that the problem of refugees has to be solved either by assimilation into a new culture or repatriation to their countries of origin. And while this book is not meant to be an exhaustive representation of the many refugee populations living in the United States, we hope to offer a glimpse into their lives and to illuminate the complexity of what it means to belong, socially, culturally, and politically, and on one's own terms as a fundamental right. Throughout our conversations, the men and women in this book express so many common hopes and dreams: to live free from fear, to have a place to call home, to experience the luxury of planning for the future, and to feel secure in their culture and traditions, and to be recognized and identified by their contributions to society rather than the circumstances under which they were forced into exile. These images and oral histories taken between 2007 and 2011 are merely a snapshot in time. If we revisited these narrators 5 years from now, their lives and perspectives may be very different. But through this brief window between past and present, inside the hotels and in the towns and cities they've resettled, we hope to paint a portrait of sorts, of those starting a new life in America with courage, resilience, and resourcefulness, and of the dynamic multicultural landscape that they will help to define for future generations. So that's part of the introduction, and I think explains a little bit about what we were trying to do and how we did it, and how maybe the oral histories and the photographs relate to each other. And I think Gabriele was going to show a movie.
Yeah. Is your class? Okay, great. Thank you.
Gabrie's going to show a clip that has some images in it, and then I was going to read an oral history, and then we can talk. an oral history that Gregory and I did in Mobile, Alabama, and talk a little bit about that refugee population because it was really, I think we both had a really awesome experience in Mobile. And a lot of the images, like all of those kids on the couch and the girl with the guitar, all of those are from Mobile. And the refugee population in Mobile is really fascinating because they're Burundian refugees, and there's like 120, and it's growing, but there's this kind of very vibrant, concentrated community in Mobile of people who, in 1972, they were exiled from Burundi, and they went and they were resettled in camps in Congo. And they lived in the Congo for like 24 years in refugee camps, and they started to reestablish their lives and start to kind of put the pieces back together again in these refugee camps and have families and start their lives again. And then in 1996, they were again driven out of the Congo by war, and they were then relocated again in Tanzania. So this is a population that has experienced being driven from a homeland or a place that you identify as your home twice before coming here. And now, a lot of the individuals that we met are now homeowners. It's a really kind of a big Habitat for Humanity community down there trying to encourage homeownership, because if you own a house, you have an investment and you feel like you belong in a place. And I think one experience that I had there, there's this church in Mobile that's amazing, and it's this Burundian church, and it's where kind of everyone goes, and it's right outside of Mobile in 8 Mile, and they all pooled all of their money, and they raised money, and it cost like $72,000, and they bought all of these bungalows, these powder blue bungalows, and they created their own church. So they most of them spend their weekends there. So when I first got there, I was driving. One of the pastors, Pastor Justin, picked me up, and we were driving out to 8 Mile, and he's like, we have to make a pit stop. We have to stop at a party. And I said, okay, sure. So we stop at this barbecue party, and it was this big kind of gathering of Burundians and also Congolese people. And it was a party for one of their friends, Alex, who was going back to Tanzania. He had been living in Mobile for 12 years, and he was going back to Tanzania. He wasn't a refugee. And it was really kind of amazing because it also doubled as the first meeting of an association that Pastor Justin was starting it was like a support group kind of for immigrants and for refugees to talk to each other and kind of share their experiences and figure out how to get resources and, deal with bureaucracy, American bureaucracy. And it was this very kind of intense moment of, celebrating the fact that this guy gets to go home, and it's so exciting because he's really looking forward to seeing his family and his friends and seeing Tanzania again after 12 years. And the reality that most of these people who are refugees are never going to have the opportunity to go back to Burundi or the Congo, which many of them identify with Congolese culture even more so than Burundian culture because they had spent 24 years there. So I think throughout this book there's a lot of that, a lot of kind of intense joy and being happy to be here, and intense pain with the understanding that you'll never be able to go back home again, and kind of the question of what home really means. So I wanted to read you an excerpt from an oral history of someone named Eliazeli Simbakoka, who is a Burundian refugee now living in Mobile. And he was born in Burundi in 1955. So I'm just going to go into it. I remember I used to have parents. Before the trouble started in Burundi, I had the expectation that I would grow up, build a house, marry, and take care of my family. I didn't know what I would be. I hadn't started thinking about it yet. I was working at my father's shop in Burundi. It was a shop that sold anything and everything from coffee to clothing. Burundi used to be a good place. But war came in 1972, and one day, militia came into my house and killed my father in front of me. There were many of them in the house, guarding the front door, so the rest of us couldn't get out. But I ran out the back door. My mother also ran away in a different direction into the bush, and I never saw her again. I ran towards Lake Tanganyika, and 10 people were chasing me with spears and knives, and I knew if they caught me, they would have killed me too. But I was faster than them. I reached the lake at 11 at night, and I saw some of my neighbors, who were also fleeing there at the water's edge. They put me on a boat with them, and the boat took us away to Congo. I was feeling a lot of grief, but my neighbors took care of me. When we arrived, Congolese soldiers received us, searched the boat, checked our pockets to see if we had any weapons. After that, they took us to the refugee camps, which was just a bush where they'd set up tents for us. I spent 24 years in the camp. During that time, I met and married my wife, and we had 5 children. I fished to earn enough money to support my family. The Congo is definitely better than Burundi. When you are a refugee, the most important thing is to save your life, even though the living conditions may not be as good. My life in Congo was not always easy, but I never thought there would be any war there. I thought everything was going to be fine for us. Sometimes we would end up meeting Congolese soldiers and they would search us and take money from us, or whatever else we had. But through all of those troubles, one thing we used to ask God was to restore peace in Burundi. If there were peace, I would have wanted to go back. If there were peace, I would want to go back now. I can think about it, but I have no hope of ever seeing Burundi again. Maybe one day my children can go back. One day in 1996, I was out fishing, and when I came home, I saw that the camp was empty. It had been attacked, and nobody alive remained. And so I ran. I searched for my family for 12 hours. Finally, I found them on the road, running away. It was the day God saved our lives. We were fortunate enough to leave before the soldiers put up roadblocks, and finally we reached the lake and we got on a boat to Tanzania. We left on a Friday, and on a Tuesday we arrived in Tanzania, where we landed into the hands of the Tanzanian police. They took us to Ntabila, one of the many camps for Burundians, one of the main camps for Burundians, which had about 70,000 people. Fleeing Burundi and then Congo, it was just grief, a lot of grief. I went away from my home country to come to a second country, where I got married, had children, and started my life, and then I had to run away again. I had a lot of worry in me, and all I could think of was attacked in the camps of Congo. I was worried it would happen again in Tanzania. If I'd had the ability then to move to the United States from Congo, I would have done it. But in Tanzania, my family had peace. Even if we were hungry, if we had peace, we were okay. We lived there for 10 years, and my wife and I had 2 more children. And then in 2007, I saw white people coming into the camps to look for Burundians who had fled in 1972. They started writing down information about us and began processing our cases so we could come to the United States. I had the good fortune of being chosen. I flew into Chicago with my wife and children. The International Organization for Migration put us in a hotel, and it was a good place. On the second day, they put us on a plane and sent us to Alabama. When we arrived in Mobile, Catholic Social Services put us up in a hotel. They brought us food and anything else we needed, and 2 days later, they gave us food stamps and a place to live. Those are the changes that I saw. My life was good. Including children, we are about 120 Burundians in Mobile, and there are another 8 people who just arrived. I'm close to the people here, but there is a lack of jobs. It is difficult to support my family now, and that's a big problem. My main challenge, though, is learning English. Everything else, paying bills and taking care of my family, everybody does these things. I have children who will be Americans, and I will become one too. When you become a citizen of a place, you have the joy and freedom of being identified as a citizen. Most importantly, you are no longer referred to as a refugee, of someone without a homeland. One thing I thank God about is that I am a fully grown man. When I work in America, I'm paid for my work, and that is why I love America, because I can support myself. It's quite different from where I came from, but my big dream is to learn English and take care of my children so they will be independent and be able to support themselves one day too. So that's Eliazeli. And
You want to read that?
I don't know, does anybody have any questions? Or, yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could speak to the role of translators if there were any.
Huge,
Because he
huge.
just said he doesn't
Speak English. It's all through translators.
So who the translators were, where you found them.
Yeah. So this translator is amazing. I found her at this church, and we became friends. And I actually kept in really close touch with her when I was doing all of the editing for the Burundi chapter, or the Mobile chapter. And she's not a refugee. She is an immigrant. She's from Kenya, but she is doing her thesis in anthropology, her dissertation on the Burundian community in Mobile. So, she speaks the language and was able to be like an amazing translator for me. So yeah, in I think almost all of these cities, translators were hugely important. And obviously it is a challenge to work through translators, especially when you kind of want to ask the same question 3 different ways, But our translators were great. They were super patient, and I actually ended up interviewing one of my translators, and it didn't go in here, but it was one of my favorite experiences that I had in the entire process of making Refugee Hotel was interviewing this one translator. So yeah, I mean, it's important, really important. And we were lucky. We were really, really lucky to have a translator whenever I needed one. It did make it difficult to follow up because I traveled to these places, we did initial interviews, then we left, and then we tried to kind of do, in some instances we went back a couple of times, but there were places that we couldn't go back to again. So we had to try to kind of do what we could over the phone. And it's hard to have like a three-way call, with an interpreter, but we made it work. I was really grateful, really grateful. Yeah. Anybody else?
I just wanted to add that language barrier. It's also very true that someone an hour ago asked us about how we selected the stories, that ended up in the book. And even when I was doing this at the hotels, and we didn't really know that we would have followed up, years later, to see how the resettlement process was going. It's very true that even your first approach with the subjects is like somehow obviously language driven, because there's people that don't speak any languages that when they arrive in America in the first 5 minutes, even little English that they might be able to do. Hey, look at me, I've been here 7 years and I'm still not able to express myself in English properly. So, but what happens is that during those first hours, I think I was lucky enough to sort of like be able to see the people that were either to speak a little English or even French, which I also speak, or like to sort of like locate in the group someone who would act as a translator. So sometimes it's not professional, it's not like pros, it's not like people that translate whatever you're saying word by word, but they're like bridges between you and the community on several levels, not only linguistically, also culturally, for example, because for some people, like there might be groups of people where it's just not proper to shake hands with a woman, for example. So these guys would say, no, don't do that, or direct you to the rooms where other English speakers are. So I find it at the same time wonderfully random and comforting that there's this chance of meeting these people, but that chance might not actually happen, and you just maybe spend 3 days in some place and you don't have any chance to make a meaningful contact. So yeah.
Thank you. So is there anything to talk about how you got the idea for the project and started working together?
Yeah, I started in 2007 when I was a student at the ICP, which is a photography school in Midtown Manhattan. And I read a story on the Times about a hotel in Queens where the refugees would spend their first night in America, and immediately it felt like a great story. What's not to like, And I went there, and obviously after the Times wrote that story, like a plethora of media rushed to do the same thing, and so I was kicked out right away from the hotel. But I was persistent, and I started I saw that many refugees that were coming had like the IOM logo, the International Organization for Migration, which is the intergovernmental organization that manages the arrival of the refugees. And so I traded photos for access, basically. At that time, I was a student. I didn't have much financial responsibility, so I could freelance, wherever I felt it was fit. And I started doing for them. But right away, they didn't like what I was doing. They felt it was too impressionistic, not necessarily something that they could run on their, internal publications or for, their promotional purposes, whatever those could be. But by that time, they sort of like, this sounds very naive. It's like a little weird to say it in front of such a qualified audience, but they just like me, and I don't know. They were like, okay, we're not going to use your photos, but we like your project, so if you want to hang out at these hotels, it's fine. We're not going to complain about that. And they gave me a lot of access. I covered 5 port of entries, and I did it for like 3-4 years. So at the end of the day, that was invaluable. And yeah, then later on, when finally I was I met Juliet, which at the time was the Greenpoint Gazette. I mean, she was the whole Greenpoint Gazette. She was writing, editing, and probably even printing and distributing the small community newspaper in Greenpoint. And I contacted her because I wanted to do a story on that poisonous creek there is between Queens and Brooklyn. But we didn't really. Do you want to take it from here? Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't do it.
We didn't do it because
I fell in love with
me.
this project. Yeah, with this project. We decided that the creek wasn't gonna. The photos might be a little bit. Photos might be a little flat. And so, I mean, Gabby showed me his photos, and we talked about it, and I immediately thought of what had happened in the time since these photos were taken. And so we spent probably like 3 months tracking down as many people from the first part of the photographs from the refugee hotels, and making contact with them and setting up trips so we could go visit. And then the project just kind of evolved from there. Each chapter is anchored in an individual or a family that Gabby met upon arrival. And then once we got there, I kind of expanded out to do oral histories with members of their communities, which I think is a super important part of, I think, living, having any experience. I think community is really central. And like that.
And refugees are also resettled in specific geographical areas where the communities already are.
Right.
So that also made very much sense to sort of like be curious beyond the people and the individuals that we actually had met
And the size
at the airport a few years.
and the size of the communities are varied, obviously. In Minneapolis, there's thousands upon thousands of Somali refugees, and in Mobile, there's a couple hundred Burundians. But it is kind of a bit of a formula of where and how they're resettled. So like we wrote in the introduction, we kind of really wanted to dispel any notion that refugees are any kind of homogenous mass, and that everyone is really different. And I wanted to read an oral history of a woman who kind of came from the other end of the spectrum than Elie Azeli. She was wealthy. She is an Iraqi refugee, and she never wanted to leave Iraq. She never thought that she would leave Iraq, but circumstances beyond her control, and she was forced to leave. Now she lives in Charlottesville, and she actually works with a resettlement agency. She started out as a translator, and now she's a case manager. So I want to read part of her oral history. Also, that baby, that little girl in the dress, that's her daughter Dina, just for reference. Okay. In a way, my life was similar to what every American child has. I had a good education and many friends. The only difference is that we lived under a dictatorship. When I was a child, fear and anticipation began to grow because of the first Persian Gulf War between Iraq and Iran. There were secret police everywhere, and you couldn't trust anyone. And if you said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person, you could get taken away in a second. When the first George Bush came in 1991, after Iraq invaded Kuwait in the Second Gulf War, it was intense and terrifying because we heard the bombs and we felt them shaking our houses. Under the UN sanctions, the economy collapsed. There was no money, no food. It was like living in a big prison. People started selling whatever they had just to survive. It sounds silly, but I remember as a child missing chocolate. Because of rations, for years we were banned from using sugar for anything other than basic cooking. So there were no cakes, no baking. Also, we didn't have electricity except for 1 hour a day. In 115-degree heat, we had nothing but a small fan. Whenever my family got together, my parents would compare our life to the golden days of Baghdad in the 60s and 70s and how they were able to travel, the culture, the before and the after. It was clear to me that my life wasn't the life normal people had in other countries. The life normal people in other countries lived. In March 2003, I'm jumping around a little bit because this oral history is combined with her husband's as well, and I'm just kind of cutting him out. So it might seem a little weird. It makes more sense if we read it all together. In March 2003, the US military entered Iraq. My family saw clouds of smoke surrounding the neighborhood. We watched the US troops on Al Jazeera. At first, we thought they were coming to free us. We knew that if Saddam was the bad guy, the United States couldn't be the bad guy. We thought the US was fighting for other people's freedom, and we had such respect for the way Americans are. This is why we were hopeful. But as time went on, that changed, because eventually we thought, are they just neglecting us because our lives are worthless? I met Mahmoud in 2003. At that time, we were both working at Al-Mustansariya University, where we'd both gone to school. We got married in November of 2004 and moved into a one-bedroom apartment upstairs from his family house. In April 2005, militia police wearing army suits came to my husband's house and took his younger brothers and his father. We don't know why. Different militia groups would target groups of people, starting with military officers, then doctors, pharmacists, and engineers. His father was originally from Kirkuk, so the whole family traveled to northern Iraq. Mahmoud got a job there. I couldn't go with him at first because I was still working at the university. There was only enough housing for workers. Also, we were hoping the situation in Baghdad would improve and that he'd be able to come home. But things only got worse, and being away from each other became something we had to manage. Mahmoud would drive down to Baghdad almost every weekend, and in 2006, I became pregnant with Dina. And that was Dina. I wouldn't want my daughter to live her life in Iraq, but I will always want her to know she is from there. I want her to be proud of who she is and where she came from. The language, the culture, the love of community is important to maintain because life is so individualized for Americans. Here I am me. I'm a person. I decide how to live my life, not my family, not my husband or my neighbor can tell me what to do. For me, it's a controversy. I can understand it as being liberated, but being part of a community is important for Iraqis. I'd like Dina to be an American in the way that she will be confident and educated and have faith in herself as a woman. But it's not easy. You must accept the mistakes you make, and you're responsible for what happens to you. One thing I found strange in America, that in American culture, people say, I'm sorry. When I first arrived, I interpreted this as an apology for the actions of the American troops and the government towards the people of Iraq. But I quickly realized that what they really meant is, I'm sorry to hear it, I'm sorry you experienced that. Some Iraqis refuse to come to America, the country they hold responsible for everything that's happened in Iraq. For me, maybe I was living with my head in the clouds. America, the land of opportunity. But when you're desperate, you think of nothing but survival. You want assurance that you're going to be safe to start a new life. And I feel safe here. I can think about my future and my family's future. I can plan for tomorrow, next week, next month. In Iraq, all we cared about was surviving one more day, and I'm learning to dream again. I hardly speak to my neighbors in Charlottesville. In Iraq, you have to know your neighbors. It's part of your character. I've been absorbed into the culture of life here, though my mother sometimes doesn't like that I'm more inclined to adapt to the American way of life. It's nice to have a community supporting me, but it's also nice to be who I am and say what I feel. But it's hard because I have to put one identity into the shadow when I act on another. For example, in my work, I have to treat all clients the same. I cannot be more helpful to Iraqis or try to make a shortcut for them. From an Iraqi perspective, this makes me a bad person. It means that I'm selfish and I'm self-centered because I think about myself, my work, and my family more than my community. A refugee is something I never thought I would be. I came from a wealthy country where a lot of people used to immigrate. It was a refuge for people who encountered hardship, not the other way around. But when I became a refugee in the US, I gave up citizenship of the country from which I fled. We are not Iraqis anymore. We are not citizens of anywhere. Of course, if it were up to me, I would live in my house in Baghdad forever, but that life is impossible now. I do want to be an American citizen because this is the country that took me in and is helping me raise my child. Even though this is the country I didn't choose, I don't have any dignity being known as an Iraqi. I know that not everybody understands us, but in Charlottesville, we have finally found a safe, secure home. Home means future plans, looking forward to tomorrow and feeling safe about today. It means having the rhythm of my life restored. So that's Farah from Charlottesville. And it just gives you an idea of kind of the range of experiences and the range of narrators in this book. Farah and Elizeli are so different. But at the same time, both of them, obviously, as every human person, it's important for them to feel safe, to have a home, to be stable, to not feel afraid that they're going to be driven from their homes again. But for Farah, I think, and for many of the narrators here, now that she's been here for a few years, she is now trying to grapple with her own identity and kind of how to negotiate two parts of herself that exist, and she doesn't necessarily feel like they can be present at the same time. So that's a really big I think, a really big issue that a lot of refugees experience is how to create an identity on his or her own terms, especially when, you know, home is such a tricky topic and it means a lot of different things, but home to these people, and I think to everyone, is so much more than a geographic location. It's so much more than a house. It's so much more than even what you recognize as familiar. It has to do with the people that you're leaving behind and how you're identified within a group of people. And I think that for a lot of people, and kind of what I learned from them, is when you lose your community, you lose a piece of yourself. And a lot of these narrators are kind of trying to find that again here. And so we spent a lot of time kind of talking about community and talking about identity. So yeah, I don't want to read too much. Does anybody have any questions?
So I know you came to this oral history work as a journalist, and you've returned to journalism now. Has doing this oral history project shaped your journalistic practice at all?
Totally. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking about this on the walk over here. I mean, oral history, I think, is a type of journalism, but it is different. For oral history, I think, for me, I learned how to listen in a way that I hadn't really known how to do, doing kind of daily newspaper writing. I mean, in many instances as a journalist, you talk to people, you call people for comments on newspaper articles, and you kind of know what you want them to say. You're not really looking for them to tell you something that is completely new to you. And with oral history, in my experience doing this, I really was coming into each interview with almost an entirely blank slate and asking someone to fill me in on everything that would happen to them. So I think it's helped me a lot, just learn how to actually really listen to people and to isolate details that I'm interested in and that I can kind of pursue and ask. You know, I mean, I know how when somebody gives me, when I interview somebody for an hour, I can pick out the details that I want them to elaborate on. Like with this, typically we would spend like 2 hours at a time interviewing someone and then come back and do, you know, subsequent interviews with them. But usually you'd be able to kind of isolate moments and memories where you really wanted to draw out more details. So yeah, I definitely have used all of my oral history, all of the skills that I learned doing this, I now use at my regular job, which, you know, but I think it's all journalism. It's just something, it's a different flavor, different brand. Anybody else? Yeah.
Has your work somehow brought about any positive, I mean, for these refugees, has it brought about any good, benefits for them? Has it changed their conditions in any way?
Well,
Apart from reading about where it is, their experiences.
their conditions? I don't think, I mean,
I doubt it.
I doubt it. I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. A lot of these resettlement agencies are really strapped. They're underfunded and don't have enough resources anyway. But two of the narrators in this, who initially were kind of suspicious and they thought, well, why are you interested in my story? Why do you want to tell it? They're now writing their own memoirs in their own languages, which is, I think, is really awesome for them, and I'm really excited to kind of help them in any way I can. But I think everyone is pretty much where, actually one narrator got it, he got a new full-time job, but that wasn't influenced by this. I mean, life goes on.
Material improvements, I wouldn't say many,
Yeah.
but definitely, like, I was thinking about your question while she was answering, and for some reason, most of these people really long for certain kind of exchange with human beings, just on the basis of, based on the fact that we are social animals, and we want to, if you see someone who's genuinely interested in you, in your story, you open up and communicate. And I think by doing that over and over, we sort of, like, in that sense, we might have had some impact on their life, because all of a sudden you're not only, refugees live like in the shadows of our societies mostly, we only really worked in except Minneapolis, we really concentrated in small towns. And it's not like there's pretty clear, how would you say that? Pretty clear borders,
Yeah.
They don't really mingle too much with the indigenous community. And all of a sudden, like, you're there and in their neighborhood, in the midst of their community, asking, about, first of all, it's usually like, hey, do you remember me? I was at the hotel when you arrived, and they're surprised. And that's already something nice. I mean, people remind you. Most of them, sometimes they call us,
Yeah.
I have a family of people of Burundian from Mobile, Alabama, that called me every Christmas, to make sure that everybody in my family is fine. They ask me if I maybe want to marry one of their daughters. I always say, no, thanks, I'm already married.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's sort of, for them, it's invaluable, it's a treasure, which makes us laugh because now many of you might want to contact me every Christmas, but for them, it's a big thing.
And on that, I had one experience where it was with this interpreter that I was telling you about earlier, that I mentioned earlier. We were sitting down and I decided that I wanted to interview her, and she resisted. She really resisted at first. And I said, no, I just want to talk to you about your life and about your experiences. And she was from Burma. And we ended up doing it and spending a long time talking about it. And at the end, she burst into tears and started crying. I said, what's wrong? And she said, I've not told anybody about any of this since I've been in the United States. And I said, really, why not? She said, because nobody asked. Nobody ever asked me about it. And I said, well, how do you feel? And she said, I feel like I'm in a lot of pain because I'm remembering all these horrible experiences that I've been trying to forget, but I also feel lighter. I feel relieved. And like Gabriele said, I think in sharing things that we take for granted, telling stories to each other, in sharing our experiences, you relate to people, and you do feel lighter when you talk about things. But
it's also invaluable. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Saying?
No,
seriously.
no.
It's also invaluable as an experience if you're interested in taking interviews or oral histories, in the field. Because one thing is when you study in books, and then another is a totally different thing when you go out of your apartment, of your own comfort zone, and approach people, which is probably Juliet should tell you about that. But it's similar to what I did with the camera. You just go out and try to sort of relate to people through your medium, right? It takes a lot. It's almost like a leap of faith into the unknown. But really, there's not much taking. I think it's more like giving than taking at the end of the day. Because when the thing is that you realize how important it is for both of you, the exchange, not only for them. At first they're just more vocal about it. They just say it because they're not used to our Western prudery. They're less. We are much more controlled in the way we, express our feelings. They hug you, and start crying because we saw each other 4 years ago, and now we see each other again, and it's a good reason to hug and cry, and you're like, it's nice to see you too, But then when you look at the work, and you read the interviews or you listen to the oral histories on the recorder, you really realize how a lot of you there is in that you were recording, So the only way to do this is really to pay attention, to be able to listen, but to be faithful not only to them but also to yourself. This is the equilibrium. This is the balance that it's hard to get, I think. And I think maybe this book will have a very short life. My dad bought all the copies of Barnes & Noble, so probably not many people will see it. But if one thing we were really keen on is having between text and images, having this balance translated in formal terms. So you see how many facts there are in what Juliet said, right? There are art facts, and she jumped to the part where the husband of this woman says that he was a nuclear engineer and now he's forced to do janitorial work at the country club. So imagine how depressing that must feel for someone who was able to split the atoms in 6 million parts, and now he has to clean up after us,
Yeah.
Do you feel like your interviewees relate to the two of you differently because you are American, you're Italian?
Hard to say. I think that's hard to say. Gabri and I did not travel together all the time.
Only a couple of times.
Only a couple of times. We traveled to Minneapolis together, and we spent a while in Minneapolis together. And we traveled to Charlottesville a lot together, and a couple other places. But because what we were trying to do was so different, and it required such a different environment. Like I really wanted to sit down with an individual and, do an oral history. But Gabri, those photos wouldn't have been interesting to Gabri. So he might spend a whole day with the same family that I would then interview the next day.
The way you get a good photo, it's basically diametrically opposite the way you get a good interview sometimes. Sometimes you need to spend a lot of time with the camera, hiding in a little bit, or playing with the kid, or doing that, which is terribly distracting for her, where she tries to, or
Really
vice
tried it
versa. Sometimes she sticks the thing like in front of everybody, and I'm like, just give me a little minute. Also, we should mention that in Minneapolis, I had like all my documents stolen, and so I was stuck there. And so Juliet didn't really want to spend a month in Minneapolis. I wanted to. I was really getting into that for several reasons. And she left for Fargo, and that's when we realized that we were much better if we acted on different paths.
We were like knee deep in the project, and I said, "I'm going to Fargo. I'll see you."
We realized that it was better to work separately.
It worked really well. Yeah, it worked really well.
We approached the same people, but sort of like each with his own rhythms and necessities and.
But I'm sure they did. But that would be a question I wouldn't be able to answer.
Being Italian, by the way, it's more like an handicap than I just want to say here at the college. I hope someone is recording because it's difficult to sometimes. But you're right somehow. Like the fact that I wasn't American somehow helped. The first part of the book, which is the part where I went to the hotels and greeted them right off the plane. I think it helped a little bit. The fact that I wasn't a U.S. citizen, obviously a foreigner myself. Even though I'm a privileged photography student, and they are people fleeing hunger or war or very good things. Come on, shoot! We have yeah.
Are all of the people that you interviewed, was the first interview always in that hotel and then you followed them years later, or you went specifically to the small community?
There are no interviews from the hotels. The hotels are only photographs.
So all of the people that you found, because you said that you didn't go to big cities, you went to small communities.
Small towns, yeah.
And why did you choose that instead of big cities?
It was a mix of necessity and actual. How would you say that? Just.
Well, we tried to. Gabri had a body of work already from the hotels. We wanted to follow up with as many of the individuals in those frames as we could. So we then tried to track down as many as we could based on the photos, based on the clues in the photos and whatever records Gabri had kept. So we we tried to track down 40, we had an enormous list, and slowly we started to locate them. And some of them we couldn't physically find them again. And so we followed them to these cities. It was almost random. We knew that we wanted to explore. There were certain communities that we knew that we were interested in. We knew there was a huge Somali refugee community in Minneapolis. We knew that we wanted to do some work there. But some other places, like Erie, Pennsylvania, we knew that there were a lot of refugees resettled there, but we knew much less about that community. And so I was really happy to be able to have an anchor there. Same with Amarillo, Texas, which is one of my favorite.
It's the
Not
archives.
cities, one of my favorite.
The archives of investigative journalism. Sometimes there's a place like she had not ever been in Amarillo once in her life, and she found it incredibly interesting. Other places that seemed more promising, or leads that were really promising, because I would say something like, "Oh, this woman at the hotel, she was amazing. I remember her. She looks like an African queen, or she's going to be amazing. She has a great story." She finally reunited with her family of 25 people, so let's go there. And then they wouldn't even want to sign the release to have their oral history recorded, which would be like a definite no-go for us, because you need to there's some boundaries. It wouldn't really matter to me if it was only photos, because I know in my art I'm not being exploitative and I'm being honest, you know. But one thing is like recording, you know, and
We had to
and
get-
write down all her
We had to get
experiences.
permission,
Yeah.
all
So we had to
permission.
respect that, even though she was amazing and the place was fantastic and
Yeah.
great photos and great stories. But
That was
So-
devastating.
so there are some moments where you feel devastated and you want to go back to New York and eat a bowl of soup at Momofuku and go to bed and feel in the comfort of your neighborhood. But it's worth going through those because then Juliet was calling me, should I go to Amarillo? Do you think we need to do that? I mean, we have a lot of people already. And I was like, yeah, we gotta go. And then,
And it was-
she didn't want to leave, and I was like,
And
ah,
it was-
get me out of here. I can't, like, I
Well,
hate
it was
it.
107 degrees, but I loved it.
I think just what was running through my head was, I was wondering if any of the people that you followed brought you to, because I mean, you said that you wanted to get, you didn't want to make refugees look homogenous group
No.
in any sense, you wanted to refute that idea. So, did any of the people that you ended up following or come across end up a huge success story in a big American city or something like that? Did that ever come?
A big success story. Some of them, I mean, some of them are
I don't
definitely.
even know, but really like achieve the American dream.
I think it depends on what the American dream is.
Right,
You
it's
know?
very subjective, but
I mean, no, I totally know what you mean, but for a lot of these people, like for these Burundians, the American dream is owning a house and knowing that they're not ever going to have anybody come into their house and tell them that they have to leave. And homeownership is really, really important to a lot of these communities, and they're doing it. They're buying houses, and that's a huge thing. They're working. Their kids are in school, which is huge. I mean, it's also very different generation to generation.
Yep.
You know, the experience of a child versus the experience of someone who's 60 years old. It's going to be drastically different. And there's 3 brothers in here. One is 25, one is 22, and one is 18. And their experiences and their perspectives on the United States and what their lives are like now are radically different. And they're only a few years apart, and they come from the same family. And they grew up all in a Thai refugee camp. So I feel like success, there are a lot of successes. Learning English, getting a job, and getting paid, you know.
I think what I was referring
But
to is more the
is-
cognitive, you know, you said a lot of the refugees are sort of on the in the shadows of society,
Mhm.
sort of living their lives. So
Yeah.
I think that's what I meant.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's a real mix. For example, there's one community that's very, very insular in Amarillo. Very, very insular. They really don't. It's a Karen community from Burma. They really don't, and they actually sign waivers with the resettlement organization saying, I agree to forego the housing that's provided to me in order to live in this area, which is rundown houses, broken everything, terrible
the worst
conditions,
conditions I've ever
terrible
experienced in my
conditions.
life in a Western
Yeah,
city.
and they choose to live there because they want to be close to each other. Versus on the other side of the city, a Chin refugee he has a really nice apartment with his wife and his baby. He's working at the resettlement organization, and he has like a completely different experience. And he's moving up the ranks of the resettlement organization, and you know, and it's like apples and oranges, and they came from the same country of origin. So I think, you know, it's all really different. But are any of these people like? Yeah, I mean.
I also would like to say something that would knock you out. I bet. So I reflect. Sometimes I think about, you know, the American. What does it mean really to like live a life the American way, or what is the American dream? We like sort of like in Mobile, that community that she mentioned, you know, of Burundians, like it's very important to own your own, you know, your house. But you would be, maybe you're surprised, maybe not. I was surprised when after, you know, a night spent together shooting and just hanging out with them, they told me that they marry in exchange of money. Like, it's widespread to go to your neighbor and say, oh, I want to get married because it's the time for me to do that. How much are your daughters? And the guy would say, oh, well, my first daughter, she can cook. She's not really pretty, but she can cook really well. So I would say like some 1,200. Is that okay with you? So you see, like this shock when they told me, it really shocked me, you know, because it's something that's totally unacceptable in my culture, you know. But that's the way to do it, and it's happening in our society somehow. So it really, like, doing work like this really bends your, you know, you sort of like you learn how to be non-judgmental at the utmost, you know, because if you start like judging people for their customs, then you're not going really far, you know.
But also, some of
even
the,
though it's unacceptable to buy someone from someone else.
but also some of the individuals that we met who are actually actively trying to, like one woman in here, who's actually, she got asylum. She's the only person who's not technically a refugee. She is an asylee. She's an Oromo woman, and she started an organization dedicated to helping refugee women from Somalia and Ethiopia kind of negotiate the gender roles that they're used to in their country of origin and their gender roles here. And it's this whole, this organization dedicated to really promoting women and teaching them skills and kind of creating the next generation of, you know, refugee or former refugee women here. And so there are a lot of organizations that these individuals are starting to help other people kind of come out of the shadows. So I feel like there are some communities that are super insular, and there are others that are trying to integrate kind of in whatever kind of way that they're doing it. So
Someone else's questions down there. I don't remember. Oh, you.
I just had a question in regards to telling the story of the refugees. In oral history, we have been talking a lot about just the right to tell the story of the refugees and giving them agency, and also allowing them to play a role in how that story is retold. I know from a journalism background, that approach is taken a bit differently. And so I just wonder if you've come across that issue in terms of how much of a role to give your interviewees in terms of formulating or structuring the book, or even the selection of the pictures and images that might be selected for the book itself. Because the lens in which the audience sees your topic matter, I think is largely influenced by the storyteller, which would be you. But how much of a role did you give to your subjects in retelling the story?
Wow. Yeah, we gotta dust off our A material here because.
well, I think initially, immediately, when we decided to do something with refugees, we knew that we wanted to have it be oral history. Like, there's no way that I wanted to do it any other way. Because I wouldn't want to filter those stories through a traditional kind of narrative journalism piece. I would want kind of the voice of the individual to be able to stand on its own. In terms of how we structured it, how we edited it,
I guess then, how did you filter that in your voices?
through their voices.
Well, you were saying that you would want to tell a story through your own voice.
Yeah.
So it's through your voices, do you see that role taking shape in the interview narratives that are included in the book? Or
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious as to what
Yeah.
part and what role did you play in helping you to retell the story?
Can I chime in for a minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, now I got it. I'm sorry. At first I was. So yeah, what I said before about so like finding your own voice in the process of recording someone else's refers to the fact that we chose oral history as a very peculiar like a vector of like. It's like there's very little. The text ends up being like very close to the actual. How do you say that? Let me start again. On one hand, the photos are very like impressionistic and sort of like almost like a personal account of what I was experiencing in a way, up to a certain extent. while the text sits on the other opposite of the spectrum. It's very much facts related. There's very little flourish in terms of like writing style. It's very direct. It's very informative. It's very facts based. So these are the two sort of like the two poles on which the book is sort of like sits on.
Yeah.
If you wanna.
In here, the narratives are exclusively oral history, so everything is in the voices of the narrators. So I tried to keep, aside from editing them, which I had to do, and asking for more details. Everything in here is in their voices, except for the chapters that I wrote about the places that they've resettled and their countries of origin. But everything else is, very, very close to their voice. Very close to it.
They also, sorry, Monica. The photos also were chosen on. Jason Fulford, which co-edited the book with me, had no real. This would sound like paradoxical to most, but he didn't really know much about what we had done. Didn't know much about the stories. Didn't know much about who these people were, and so but I was glad to sort of like leave room for him to sort of like build an edit that would only take on account the visual storytelling more than a certain connection to the text, because I also shoot for like magazines, and actually that's all I do basically. I shoot for newspapers and magazines, and photos are often illustrations of what the text, the copy is about, and this is amazing, and it's like it's what we do, but we wanted to try something slightly different for the book, because we had room to do so, and so we decided to push a little bit on that and have like photos that were. Sometimes, the subjects are there, but they're not clearly identifiable, for example, or it was more important for us image people to have like a certain flow in the images. I have like, as I was saying before, like stories that only go on, for example, on the left side of the book, on the left pages, and stories that go like, so sort of like parallel play between left and right. Or we had like stuff that we had like themes that recur, so that you like brought to go back at the start of the book, because you see these themes echoing through the images. These are techniques that are peculiar to visual storytelling and not necessarily apply to text. Similarly, the ways probably I suppose the text was edited, some stories were chosen for criteria that didn't have anything to do with how we selected the images or how we based those storylines.
Yeah, it was really.
So it was a great relationship, creatively speaking, because we had to sort of like make it all come together in book form, coming from so many different angles, and very different walks of life. So. Did I sort of make sense? Because sometimes it makes sense in Italian, but when I translate it in English, the sense disappears. Monique, you were saying.
When you first envisioned the project, and then throughout the course of making it into the book, did you feel that the final product evolved and it varied from what you originally envisioned? And if so, how?
I can only speak for myself, but I think so. I did dramatically. It feels like I always, Juliet always sort of like looks at me with a little bit of grief when I say my book, but it's really our book in the widest sense. I mean, it's not only mine and Juliet's. It's with Voice of Witness, Max Sweeney, all the people that worked for it, and it was tough. Sometimes there were tough confrontations. They were like we didn't really agree on things, and then we had to like sort of like each of us had to like make a step towards understanding each other. It was great. It's really amazing. And if you have like book projects, and I strongly suggest you to pitch them to them, because they're really nice. They're really respectful of the authors, and they're more inclined to work with you than just follow their own idea of how the book has to be edited.
In terms of the material in it, like, I think as the years went by, Gabri started in 2007 taking photographs of refugees on their first night in the United States, and then doing the oral histories and learning more and more about kind of what they had been through, and then Gabby going back and taking photos of them, 5 years later, created kind of an arc. And so it was, I feel like the book was evolving the entire time that we were doing it, and I really wasn't sure what it was going to look like when it came out. I mean, I didn't have very much kind of knowledge of how the layout was working. That was kind of like Gabri's thing. So, I mean, doing just the oral histories without the photos, it's like a completely different project when you look at them together. Like the relationship between them, it creates a completely new story, I think, that is told in addition to the individual stories and kind of the visual stories of transition. So I think it evolved a lot.
I just have a question about expanding it or maybe how you narrowed it down. Because it's interesting that you're talking about being in the shadows, sort of spiritual shadows. But I was wondering if you interviewed people, like Americans who were in these communities, who had and how they felt about the entrance of all these refugees into their communities, or maybe the people in the factories, or people in the hotels, and if there was any interaction between the shadow and the people like,
Totally. In the book? No. In the book, it's totally exclusively voices of refugees. But in my experiences in the cities, yeah, I did. I talked to, if I could talk to people that they worked with, I did. Talked to a lot of people who worked with them at the resettlement agencies in the different, in the kind of different capacities. And like other, for example, the Burundian pastor, this Pastor Noel Sunzu, who Gabriele and I are both like super close with, and he's kind of the anchor of the Burundian community. When he first came to Mobile, he was actually he was working alongside another pastor who was Alabama. So I talked to him about how this community is and how they grow and how they interact with everyone else. So from my perspective, like I learned a lot, but we had to kind of keep it narrow, and we had to cut so much out of it already. So yeah, but that
it's pretty thick.
Would you like to expand it? Like, do you have plans for this that include a larger book, more stories, more photos?
There's millions of stories
there's
that
so
come
many,
out. Yeah.
there's so many stories. Yeah,
It's impossible to sort of. While we were doing it, very often we would like just take a note saying, "Oh, this is going to be our next project."
yeah.
But
at some point we were like, okay, we have so much stuff. Like we have like 6 years worth of photos. Like we have to
yeah.
and deal
Also,
with them.
I'd like to say that I don't know how many of you are actual photographers or are really interested in photography, but it's a weird thing that happens to most of us photographers is that when you really don't want to do something anymore, that's when you take the best photos for some paradoxical reason. So for a while, I sort of like thought that could have been the case, because if you tell me tomorrow we go back to Mobile, Alabama, I'd be like, no, don't do this to me. I don't want to. But maybe there's something there. I'm sure there is. But you're free. I mean, if you like the book a year from now, which is a good time, so like think about something and you still feel it, and you want to know more about that community where people buy each other's wives, I'll tell you who they are. I'll give you copies. Always.
And do they sell husbands too?
Well, that'd be convenient, right? So, no, they don't. It's just the peculiarity of men to buy women, but not the other way around. Unsurprising.
Do you go to Clarkston, Georgia?
No.
No.
We
Do you
didn't.
know? That's a very similar community. I'm just wondering if you've gone there. Because it used to be, this is the reason I'm asking, it used to be Ku Klux Klan headquarters, it was 9% white, and now it's 14% white. It's almost entirely refugees.
Wow.
And there's a soccer team called like the...
Yeah, soccer
Do you know the soccer team?
Yeah.
So there's a whole story there. I just wasn't sure if you at all. No.
Soccer
Did you
is
talk
also one
about
of
the? Sorry.
Please.
Did you talk about the future? I mean, it seems like some of these girls become Americans.
Yeah.
I traveled in Somalia,
Yeah.
I mean, did you talk about what would happen if you were one American love, or what happened with circumcision and stuff like that was
Wait,
forbidden here?
the
I mean, I
future
respect
of-
the culture, but there's certain things that, you know, did you kind of touch base on those kind of touchy kind of things?
Just the future of things in
No.
there.
Girls from Somalia growing up here become Americans.
Yeah.
Love, they don't accept like
Mhm.
planned marriages.
Actually, the Somali community was really hard because I was not able to interview any Somali women.
Because
this
you were not
reason.
allowed to.
I wasn't allowed to. They wouldn't. I mentioned earlier when we were in the class that very often I would meet people, make dates to interview them, and then they would not show up or disappear. And it was really hard because I really, really, really wanted to interview some Somali women and ask them about kind of what it is like growing up in a place.
But they're in the book, right?
It's no, like they're not in the book. They're not in the book. We didn't interview any Somali women.
Yeah, we
weren't
totally
able to.
tanked on that
Yeah.
Somali woman.
Yeah, we
student
totally.
team or
Yeah,
something.
we couldn't
It's
do
tough.
it.
They
It's really
they
tough.
don't show up, you know. And
Yeah.
as much as you can force yourself in an environment, you're free to speak with the boys or with the men, but the
Yeah,
women
the women.
just
Yeah.
don't show up.
And we weren't, and because our purposes were, we cast kind of a bit of a wide net, and we had a lot of different cultures that we were focusing on. I didn't want to push it too much.
I want to say something though about so in Minneapolis, where we approach many of our potential Somali
Yeah.
subjects, there's like in front of the housing complex where these guys live, there's like a low-rise building where all of the basically it's where all the commercial transaction happen. Like there's like a bank inside, a place where you can change money, phones, buy clothes, buy buy all kinds of food that is proper to their religion and all that. And there is also one barbershop which I went to almost religiously every week, just to have a feel of the neighborhood, what was going on, and a hairdresser for a woman. And the barbershop, it's like the most rundown barbershop ever probably been established in the United States of America. It's just a room with whatever you say to them, they just cut your hair with the razor, and they're totally oblivious to what you ask. Like, so you say, make it like short here, and then they do like short ear, or they do like crazy stuff. But it's nice because you talk to people, and you're like, oh, so where are you from? Do you know that family that was resettled here? And they know each other. It's nice. It's a nice way to get into the neighborhood. One of my desires, like before I die, I really hope I'll be able to peek into the hairdressers for women, because it was like it sound. I can only tell you how it sounded like, because there was like a slab of wood in front of the door that prevented anyone from just any of the passers-by just to peek in what was happening. But you could hear like amazing noises from the inside, really like women chatting like very fast, and music and objects tumbling on the floor, and people like shrieking and screaming, and it's such a sort of like such an unexpected burst of life and expression, opposed to their approach when you meet them in the street, for example, or even in their homes. Sometimes I always had like this feeling that I won't be a man until I see what it looks like, what that hairdresser place looks like, or take a photo there somehow. I just stayed like in my imagination.
What was your kind of entry into these people's lives? Like, how do you negotiate taking pictures of them, their first night at the hotel? How do you sell the interviews with them? How do you convince them to participate in the interviews?
I think we hung around for a while, and we were pretty open and straight up about what we were doing there. But I mean, before you start interviewing, you have to let people get to know you a little bit. And I think once people got to know us, they became more comfortable. Some of them. I mean, as I said, some people are not okay with being interviewed, but people tended to open up. They opened up to us as we opened up to them, and they decided that we were okay. And they decided, okay, I'll let you interview me a little bit for an hour. And then they'd be like, okay, actually, we can talk more. So it was kind of a gradual process, but people were pretty open. People were pretty open for the most part with us, yeah.
Yeah, I will also tell you that, especially in the hotels, like that, we are full of fear, you know, of meeting the other. But really, people are really eager to talk. They mostly, you know, and the people that don't want to talk, you get right away. Even sometimes people are willing to communicate beyond their language barriers, you know. So for me, I also have to say that it would sound a little cynical, but you know, when they arrive here, they're so disoriented. They're tired because it's a long trip usually, and they don't know what to expect. We used to say, you know, jokingly, that they on the cusp between two different uncertainties: the past, which has been sorrowful and a big question mark of where to live, where we're going to be, what's going to happen to us, and the future, which they don't know anything about. So the first night is usually like, oh, they don't know what the AC is, or they fumble in front of the television and watch like ads for hours, or they don't know what a tub is. I once saw a family trying to sleep between the frame of the bed and the mattress. So this is how like disoriented they are. And sometimes they love that there's someone there that's willing to spend 5 extra minutes and explain that no, that's not the way we sleep. We sleep on the mattress, but not under it. And that by itself is sort of like, it's a way in, if you want to think of it that way. I tend not to, because first of all, because I did it several times, even with families I wasn't interested in photographing. And I'm sort of like strictly martial about what really makes me want to take a photo, which is usually really, this I shouldn't say out loud at the journalism school, but it's usually very much an aesthetic point that makes me really want to pursue something, you know, in terms of photographs. I see beauty, maybe in a moment, or someone's body language that brings me. I want to photograph that. So that's what interests me. Then maybe the story of that person is totally, uninteresting. But you know, I think though that for Juliet was harder than that, because. And you're free to say yes or no, I don't know really, but to me it's easier to sort of like, the camera is a great business card somehow, you know, it gets you into places, because you're there like doing stuff, you hide a little bit behind it, you know, you hide your joy, you hide tears when they arrive, you know, and you feel like moved. There's always something between you and them. It's just, to sit down with someone and ask them about the time where they like tortured, it's much more harsh and direct, and it needs to be mediated much more, I think. So it takes much more work to do what she does probably than what I did. Is it true or no?
Oh, not more work, but like different. I think it just takes time and trust. And that just comes with being around, I think. And being totally as open with everybody as you hope that they'll be with you. You know?
How did you make decisions about cutting down all the material back to one point? Were there any like topics or ideas that you favored in something else?
Well, we had to cut out Albany altogether, which was really sad because it was super interesting. Albany was really interesting. Albany, New York, yeah, but we cut it out. Actually, it wasn't our decision. I think it was the editors chose.
That's what editors and publishers are for, really. They make your life
Yeah.
very sad and miserable.
Yeah, they're like, cut it. It's too much. And especially with the text, because we always knew that this was going to be 2/3 photos at least. So there's only a certain number of pages that I had.
Still.
So it was really, I knew that there were going to be a lot that didn't make it. So I just had to.
Juliet is a saint. Like she,
Okay.
yeah, she was really amazing. I made a lot of fuss about the way the book was being edited when we were working on it, and then I realized that she had like lost a lot more than I was losing in terms of content that I had produced of it, you know.
But it's okay.
But she's a woman, so she knows better. I'm just, you know.
In terms of I noticed that the countries of origin, there's like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? 6?
Yeah.
Did you choose those, or did you end up with those?
We ended up, I mean, honestly, we went from it was like an absolute process of Gabri meeting the individuals and us following them to wherever they came from, and usually there we settled with other individuals and families who are from their same country of origin, and so those communities kind of take shape, and we decided to do our reporting, there. But they're all anchored by individuals, so it was all pretty much by chance.
Also, refugees' fluxes are difficult to. Really, it's impossible to say. There was a media outlet that was interested in doing a story on the book, so they forced me. Basically, they really forcibly took me to one of the refugee hotels that I had photographed to sort of redo what I was doing 3 years ago. So 3 days ago we did that, and I realized that I thought, for example, that when Iraqi refugees resettled anymore, but there were 95 that day only. It surprised me. It's hard to say what the scope of the. But if it makes you feel great, and it should. The United States is the country in the West, among the Western countries, that absorbs the most refugees. Even though very few of the refugees are actually, have, the chance to be resettled in such a rich country.
They haven't seen it yet, have they? I was saying before, I just got mine last week, so we haven't had a chance to send any out. I just got them, so we're gonna have to send them out when I get back to New Orleans.
We feel like.
Me too. Well, we're gonna go down to Charlottesville, where we spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time with this one Karen family, and are really close to all of them. So we'll see them in person, and hopefully be able to go back. I mean, that was part of it. We wanted to, after this was done, we wanted to go back to each of the communities that we spent time in and give them the book and maybe do an event, there. But
it was part of the plan, in fact.
It was part of the plan.
To do events in the cities where we had shot photos, and we applied for a grant. At the Open Society Institute, but we didn't get it.
We didn't get it. And then I also moved down to New Orleans, which makes everything impossible because Gabrielle and I live so far away from each other.
I'm still very upset about the grant.
Gabrie's really sorry. But no, we definitely intend. We absolutely intend to send everyone a copy. And some of them have actually started asking me is it done yet? It's been taking a really long time.
But we feel like we did a great deal, right? Because we're awesome. But this was only printed in 2000 and change copies, so it's not, also, believe it or not, the access that we have to actual copies is very limited.
Right, I know. I didn't have a copy. I didn't have a regular copy for not one copy for a really long time. I got it late.
And my dad bought all the ones that were ago, so even less.
But yeah, that's all part of. They're all getting copies, and they were all, as I said in the class earlier, everyone in here knows exactly what their oral history looks like. There shouldn't be any surprises. Everyone had a really a hand in making sure that they understood exactly what was going on in terms of their own histories. So. Yeah.
The last question, Ellen? Well, that segues just into my question, because did people get to see their photographs the way they got to review their oral histories? In oral history, the interviewee really can hold back sections or revise, but that's maybe not true of a photograph, and maybe you gave them their photographs ahead of time.
They did not. And in fact, but I doubt, in a way I can tell you that I doubt they want to see me again, because I hang out for so long at their places sometimes that they might not have any intention to see me. But no, actually, that was half a joke, in the sense that the people that ended up in the book, especially in the resettlement part, I had the privilege of having a good relationship by now. So sometimes there are many chances of exchange. Sometimes they write on my Facebook page. Sometimes they call me, as I was saying, and they never really showed a particular interest towards the outcome of what I was doing. But they placed a great deal of emotions and value on our actual relationship while I was there doing it.
And the only time, just I want to interrupt for a second. The only time I ever heard any one of these narrators ask for photos is photos of their kids.
Yeah, they're like,
Send me
oh,
a
can
photo
you
of
send me
your
like
kid.
photos? And I always did
Yeah.
when I could, sort of like, even though photographers say, if you take photos and say, can I have a photo one day? Yeah, one day I'll send it. Because usually we say, yeah, but then life happens and then it's another job, then it's another thing, and it's another family. But this sort of like made me think about how much like we, it's almost like having our world mirrored by a different world, that has different expectations, and we see things our expectations towards our relationships are different. We are very worried of not being exploited. We are very worried of not, or maybe we're just curious by nature, We think we don't place maybe much value on the process, but more on the outcome of things, for example. While they might be inclined to just live life by the moment or just enjoy the ride, just maybe that they feel that way. I don't know. It's tough. Also, it's tough to generalize because it's different cultures, very different, crazy. But I wish I had also the means to do it. It's tough for me to sort of like send a book to each one. It would be great. But it would be something that McSweeney said to do.
Yeah. No, but that's all. That's gonna happen. It's all.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was like part of it. Like everybody has to get a book, so they will.
For now, we're just sending books to the Kickstarter supporters.
Oh yeah.
Which I'm on some 147.
Yeah.
I have to personally send
It's
it.
the only downside of Kickstarter. A lot of mail. Great thing. Wouldn't have been able to do it without it.
Wait.
Lots of mail.
All right, well, thank you.